Hello, everyone. It's great to have you join us today. I'm Lionel Phillips, the chairman of the board for the Make Well Known Foundation. And part of the Make Well Known Foundation is the National Minority Cardiovascular Alliance. So we certainly thank you for joining our third annual town hall. We wish that we can be in Washington, D.C. in person, being all together, but I'm so fortunate to be able to speak with you and to join you in this important work, in this important conversation today through Zoom. So thank God for Zoom so that we can maintain our discussions and the work that we do. So today's theme is the impact of race and ethnicity on cardiovascular health in the U.S. Where do we go next? There has been a tremendous amount of discussion with the advent of social injustice, with the reality of COVID, and a lot of information out there on cardiovascular health. Certainly COVID has certainly allowed us to better understand how it impacts the communities in which this alliance is focused on. And so we learned a lot. So the conversation today is not about what we've learned, but most importantly is based on what we've learned, what do we do about it? And how do we progress and make change moving forward?
Thank you, Lionel. Next, I'd like to introduce one of our co-chairs at the National Minority Cardiovascular Alliance, Dr. Fatima Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is an assistant professor at Stanford University, a health disparities researcher, and a practicing non-invasive and preventive cardiologist. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, for being with us today and moderating our next session titled, A Conversation on the Inclusion of Racial and Ethnic Diversity in Clinical Research.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all the panelists and participants for joining us. Next slide. Next slide. Great. So during this conversation today, we're going to review the historic challenges and shortfalls that have impacted diversity in clinical trials. And we've heard a little bit already about that in our prior conversations. Discuss some success stories and best practices for inclusion of these groups based on our panelists have a lot of experience in this area, and really spend time sharing recommendations, what we can do moving forward to improve representation of minority patients, particularly in cardiovascular trials. Next slide. So where are we today? The discussion of clinical trial diversity continues to be very relevant and timely topic, and we've really seen this come to light with the enrollment of minority patients in COVID-19 trials as we think forward about COVID-19 vaccine trials. And this is indicative of a larger trend that we have seen throughout the years. So we've talked about the issues of mistrust. Dr. Coons provided data in the Black population about mistrust for clinical research and participation in clinical trials, lack of awareness, and other barriers that we hope to discuss today that hinder optimal recruitment. But where do we go from here? And this is just a snapshot of the 2019 of all trials, not just cardiovascular disease trials, and the representation of specific subgroups. And as you can see, we have a long way to go. And again, we saw that numbers are even lower for cardiovascular trials for the recruitment and representation of Black and African Americans, Asians, Hispanics that really represent the US population. Next slide. So I hope you, as you've heard earlier today, is that as an organization, the Make Well Known Foundation is really committed to better understanding the similarities, the uniqueness of genetics, culture, and social determinants of health. And it's really imperative for us to include clinical trials in this discussion. As a practicing cardiologist, many of us are clinicians here, we really use clinical trial evidence to inform our practice. So by that introduction, I want to talk about our three panelists. I'll briefly give an introduction and then let them each make some comments and statements. I'll start with our first panelist, Dr. Latha Palaniappan, who is an internist and renowned clinical researcher at Stanford University. Her research has really focused on the study of diverse populations, chronic disease management, and prevention. Dr. Palaniappan has focused specifically on understanding diversity within Asian subgroups. During her time in the Palo Alto Medical Foundation, she served as the medical director of clinical research and really led organization-wide initiative to collect better data of patient race ethnicity using electronic health records. She's the co-founder of Prana, a South Asian wellness program, and is the co-director of Stanford Center for Asian Health and Research Education. On a personal level, Dr. Palaniappan is my mentor and sponsor and has really inspired my career in the field of health disparities, so really delighted to have her here. Our next speaker is Dr. Veita Bland, and Dr. Bland is in private practice in Greensboro, North Carolina. She specializes in clinical hypertension, and she has a strong voice in enabling the community to treat hypertension intensively. Her passion lies in teaching medical students and in clinical research. Dr. Bland is a frequent speaker on hypertension and lipid issues, and she's also the host of a weekly radio call-in program addressing health issues and writes a weekly health column. She's a graduate of Temple Medical School in Philadelphia and completed her residency in the University of Maryland. She's a clinical hypertension specialist and board certified in family medicine, and she's going to provide some unique insights of how she does clinical research in a private practice setting. And finally, our last panelist is Dr. Gladys Velarde, who is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Florida, where she serves as a fellowship program director, so really teaching our next generation of physicians and scientists. And it serves as the medical director for cardiovascular and women's health at the University of Florida. She received her medical degree from New York University and completed her training at Columbia, and then a fellowship at Mount Sinai in New York and Boston University. Her clinical interest and expertise includes echocardiography, preventive cardiology, and heart disease in special groups. And she has a long-standing commitment to reduce ethnic disparities in cardiovascular health and really brings a lot of experience to this area. So we'll start off with Dr. Palaniappan, who's going to share some insights on how to increase diversity in clinical trials.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. It's a delight to be here, and thank you to NMCA and Lionel Phillips and the whole team. Really, I've been so impressed by the organization of this town hall, and I hope you all are enjoying it as much as I am. So we'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to go over some background, and you've heard a little bit about this already today, but as you've seen from the data that Dr. Clark also presented, there is a vast degree of underrepresentation of Black, Hispanic, Asian, and women at either end of the age spectrum. And it's not specific to industry or academic trials, and it's persistent across therapeutic areas. And this is a problem that's been repeatedly confirmed in the literature and in FDA snapshot reports, which you saw Dr. Clark present. And this is a problem that ethnic minorities are underrepresented in healthcare genomic databases. There's a lack of adequate representation to even understand the physiology and pathobiology. And there's and when we have looked, we have uncovered some very interesting pathways that enable us to take better care of all of our patients. And there's new methodologies in artificial intelligence and machine learning and neural networks and precision medicine. And I'm excited to report, I just found out this morning, one of my other trainees, similar to Dr. Rodriguez, recently scored a 10, which is a perfect score on his NIHK award, and it was to look at gastric cancer in Korean subgroups. They have 20 times the rate of gastric cancer. And it's thought that this might be due to several factors, including aldehyde dehydrogenase deficiency or Helicobacter pylori infection. But by studying these groups that are at high risk, we're able to uncover potential therapeutic areas that would benefit everyone. So I'm very excited that the next generation, including Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Wang, now he's actually on his honeymoon and he found out this great score. So that was very good news to have this morning, that we'll be able to advance the science of precision medicine in diverse subgroups. So an important thing to remember also is that there's a possibility of type 2 error. Just because we don't find a difference doesn't mean that there isn't a difference. And oftentimes the sample sizes in our studies are too small to assess a difference. I was actually talking to a reporter this morning for American Heart Association for an abstract that's coming out, and they didn't find some differences in some groups, but it was likely simply because the sample sizes weren't large enough. And this is something that we should keep in mind going forward. And obviously, resources are limited and we can't power every trial to examine every subgroup. And we have to make decisions about when to omit, when to disaggregate, when to extrapolate. And, we don't have, it's not the same answer every time, but we do need to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. And as we heard so eloquently earlier, it is not only biological heterogeneity or of the treatment effect, but there's also questions of health equity, fairness, and public trust. Next slide, please. And, we've talked a lot today about race ethnic diversity, but as we all in healthcare leadership positions move forward, we should acknowledge that diversity exists across many dimensions, both seen and unseen. And you see some examples of that here, including race, ethnicity, but also sex and gender, ancestry, age, social determinants of health, as Dr. Kuhn so eloquently mentioned, as well as environmental factors, genetics, comorbidities that are treated by concurrent medications, and other that we perhaps haven't defined yet. And we should also consider the intersectionality of these categories. Next slide, please. So this is a slide showing on the left-hand side a post hoc subgroup analysis of the different groups. And you can see that in some instances, the confidence limits cross the line of unity, which is the dotted line. And when those lines, those confidence limits are wider, it means that you have uncertainty around the treatment effect. And we should design our studies from the get-go that will have precision around those estimates. So those lines around the dot are narrower. And so if there are differences between the groups, we can see them. And we should begin with the end in mind. We can't, I've heard the phraseology, boil the ocean today, and I think that's apt. And we should think about what we want to achieve in terms of health equity, balanced with biological variability when we design our clinical trials. And I also teach population health to the medical students and residents at Stanford. And one concept that I like to emphasize to them is this concept of equity. So when we're all children, we really want equality, that we get the same things that our brother or sister gets from our parents. But as we move forward, we realize maybe when we're parents that there is a concept of equity, that to use the family example, some children need more. And in the example of our society, some people and groups need more to achieve the same standards. And Dr. Kuntz gave an excellent example of that with the computers and broadband. So, and this is something that we need to apply in clinical trials, not just every participant gets the same incentive, but that some participants, to give the example of women, might need childcare to participate in clinical trials, or other participants might need transportation, and you might not do the same thing for everyone, and some groups will need more. Next slide. So Dr. Clark talked a little bit about these barriers to participation. I'll just mention some of them. And we talked about this a little bit at our steering committee meeting this morning. But there is currently a lack of patient and community engagement with the groups that we want to help and address. And this is something that Community-based organizations like National Minority Cardiovascular Alliance can help address, and the Make Well Known Foundation. There is a lack of diverse workforce and professional development, and many members of the NMCA steering committee are addressing this. In terms of data collection and data analysis, I touched on this a little bit. There are lack of data standards. We don't even collect race ethnicity uniformly across healthcare institutions in the United States, and this is a problem. And this is one thing that I did at Palo Alto Medical Foundation, but I find it is a problem as we move forward in our national data registries in American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, for instance. And in terms of patients, advocates in the communities, one thing I refer my patients to is the FDA website, where you can look up the drug that you're taking and which race ethnic groups that drug has been tested in. So sometimes patients don't know that, when we prescribe a certain drug to them. I'll give an example of allopurinol, which is a commonly prescribed gout drug. And there's a certain mutation in Han Chinese populations, HLA mutation, that causes more Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a severe adverse skin reaction that occurs much more frequently in people with this mutation. But that mutation is present in Han Chinese mainly. So if you are not practicing in a diverse environment, that pharmacogenetic variant might not matter. But if you practice in an area with a high Asian population, as I do in the Bay Area, this is something that we really need to be aware of and to test so we can provide precision prescribing for our patients. You can go to the next slide. So this is for those in the audience that are involved in drug development, sort of delineating in each phase where diversity should be considered for drug discovery. So this should be considered even in the preclinical phase. I've also done a lot of work in women's health, and it was shocking for me to find in my training that, for instance, when we did animal studies, female in the preclinical phase, female animals weren't considered because there were all kinds of variables to consider, like where the animals were in their menstrual cycle. And obviously this is not applicable to real life because women take these medications that are tested in the preclinical phase only on male models. So similarly for race ethnic groups, and I've been fortunate to establish this Center for Asian Health Research and Education, and through philanthropic support, we've been able to fund seed grants. And one of our seed grants is for study of stem cells in Asian populations. And one thing that we have found is that stem cells in these Asian populations, specifically South Asian populations, had less angiogenic properties. So we're less likely to create blood vessels compared to stem cells made from non-Hispanic white participants. So these are the trials, these preclinical trials that precede the clinical trials. And so those should be considered, diversity should be considered even in that preclinical phase. And then on to post-marketing studies. So half of all drugs that have been taken off the market were for adverse events in women that were largely found in pharmacovigilance studies, so post-marketing, post-phase 4 even studies. So it's important to do studies of safety and efficacy of these drugs after the drugs are already on the market as well. Next slide. So in terms of the partnerships that we make with the participants and advocates, as well as site investigators, the study clinics, contract research organizations, as well as academic institutions and industry and government sponsors, we need to hold ourselves accountable at each stage of this process. And here are some examples with regard to what metrics would we measure.
Looks like we just lost Dr. Palaniappan's audio for a second. Let me just see how many.
Yeah, it does appear that
She's almost towards. Yeah, she's almost towards the end of her. She has just one more slide, so I think it's okay. She just logged off. If perhaps we move on to the next presentation.
Sounds good, Dr. Rodriguez.
So that was a wonderful overview by Dr. Palaniappan. And again, she's really a leader in this area, particularly around Asian health. So she will join us for the panel shortly. I'm sure she's just going to work on her audio. The next presentation, just some comments and remarks, is Dr. Bland, who will talk about the very important topic of research in private practice, really where we see many of our patients and where patients really have unique connections with their care team. So Dr. Bland, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to present today. Next slide, please. We are a small practice in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I wanted to talk about what it is like to do trials in a small practice. The first thing that I'd like to say is that it truly takes a dedicated team, a team that is loyal, a team that understands what we do is important. Next slide, please. In our small practice, we have a physician who is a gerontologist, and I am a hypertension specialist. We also have a nurse practitioner. Just having this gives us a base of many patients with many different problems. Next slide, please. The main thing, though, that is important about what we do is that we have a history with these patients. They know us. They trust us. They know that we are in their corner. We've been with them. Some of them have been in our practice for 20 years. We've taken care of their parents. We've taken care of them, their children. And I think the relationship is what is most important about some of the relationships that we have here. Next slide. They know our motives, and they know that they can trust us. They know that we are here for them. Next slide. And this trust has been built up through many years and many times that we have interacted with them. And there must be a respect that is formed, and we must honor them also. That is so very important, that they know that we are in their corner, that they know that we are here to help them. And that's important because they know we're not going to do anything that is going to harm them. Now, certainly we have a great base, but also when we bring other patients into our practice or into our research, it's important that we establish a relationship with them. And in some of the cases, we establish a relationship with them, and we establish a relationship with their families. Because when it comes time for them to do a study, a lot of times they're going to want to know what their family members think about something. So they may come in and work with us to find out who we are, what we are about, and to make sure that we can be trusted. It is the relationship that they know. And I think the fact that we've been in the community for a while does help. Next slide, please. We talk to them. We talk to them continuously about things. They have our numbers. They know they can get us at any time, so they don't feel that they're out there and no one is taking care of them. And again, I say this over and over, the trust is the most important thing, because they will say things like, well, what about that Tuskegee thing or something like that. So it's important that they know that we are here. It is important that they know that they can trust us. And it is important that we show them this with everything that we do. Next slide, please. Okay. When we are getting someone in a study, sometimes it really requires a lot of hand holding. And each care is individualized. And what I mean by that is when we're trying to get someone into a study and we're letting them know about the study, we may talk to several family members before they are feeling comfortable enough to join the study. But it's important that they know that it is a situation that we're going to be here for them and that we're going to be here through the long term for them. And as I said, they have our numbers. They know how to get us if anything happens. Next slide, please. One of the things that happens also, and again, we are a small family practice. If their experience is positive with us, if they feel that we've taken care of them and we've made it a positive experience, they will refer others to us. And that's important because we only have so many people in our practice. And if we want to populate other studies, we need referrals from others to come into our practice. So it's important that they have a very positive experience with us so that they will refer others, whether they be family, friends, or whatever, into our practice or into the study that we are trying to do. And we find that important also, as I said, when there are studies where people are being referred from television ads, radio ads, now internet ads. It's just important that people know who we are in the community and that we can be trusted. Next slide. So, research in private practice. It's really important that you have a strong and personable staff. I can't emphasize how important it is that your staff is strong and that the patients know that that staff is going to be there. Once you have that staff, it's also very important that we empower them. We empower them to help take care of the patients. We empower them to help us to do the study. We also show our staff appreciation, and we also show our patients appreciation. And what I mean by that, there may be some cookies out when they come in. There may be, little things like that out when they come in. There may be a soda out when they come in. Just something that says we're glad to see you. And of course, it's important that we train our staff well. And of course, next, good oversight by us here who are the PIs to make sure that the study is carried out correctly. Next slide. Thank you so very much. We need more opportunities for studies. We need understanding that sometimes this type of recruitment may take more time and effort. And what I mean by that, sometimes we will do a study, and if we haven't gotten people in by a certain time, they may want to close our site down. But hopefully we try to get them to understand that sometimes it takes a little bit more hand holding to get our patients in than maybe it will for other sites. And to make sure that we have the financial support to maintain our professional staffs, to make sure that we have them trained well, and to make sure that we can pay them well. So research in private practice is a little bit different. This is the way we do it at the Bland Clinic. Thank you so very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Bland. That was a really wonderful, and I think it really highlights that, we really need to meet patients and potential study participants where they are. And most of these patients and participants are in the community, and the tertiary, quaternary care centers that many of us work in may not be the best places to recruit these participants. So thank you for that. Dr. Velarde, and now I'll turn it over to you for your comments.
Fatima, thank you so much. I just joined in. I missed this very important part. I just caught the end of it because I was in clinic taking care of patients, but just catching the end of the presentation makes me, smile, because I think that we need all the research in many areas, and that has to be fostered. And it's not common. It's not the the traditional route. So I commend them for doing it, and I apologize for joining in so late, but it is the way it is, right? And
no
I'm
problem.
here.
We appreciate you, being frontline, taking care of our patients. I introduced you at the beginning, Dr. Velarde, training our next generation of physician researchers and clinicians in cardiology. So we thank you for that. So I think if you don't have any additional comments broadly, Dr. Velarde, that you want to share, maybe I can move on to a few questions just to get the discussion started with the panel.
No, you go ahead, Fatima. If there are any specific points that you would want me to address, I'd be happy to do that. But I think that, you're rolling with the flow, and I think you should continue to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Velarde. So we certainly have a few questions I've just jotted down for discussion through the presentations, but then we certainly want to have time to open it up to questions from the audience, especially with this esteemed group of panelists that have a lot of experience in this important area. So we've talked a lot about barriers to racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials and some potential ways to mitigate these barriers. I think sometimes it's easier to where do we begin? What's the low-hanging fruit in order to see change? And I'll start with Dr. Palaniappan, because unfortunately we finished her talk a little early. See any suggestions, any easy kind of first steps that we can all take?
Well, I really enjoyed Dr. Bland's presentation, and the comments that she made are really where the rubber meets the road in terms of recruiting diverse trial participants, and everything that she emphasized in terms of building trust in the community and being there for the patients, not only for research, but also their clinical care. And I always tell participants, research is not a substitute for your clinical care, and it's important to fill that gap as well. And then also, providing oversight, regulatory oversight of the studies is so important and often overlooked. So thank you for bringing up those points, Dr. Bland.
Thank you. Dr. Bland or Dr. Velarde, any kind of just low-hanging fruit that we can begin to tackle to increase diversity in our clinical trials?
I find that sometimes because when you call our office, it tells you that we do clinical trials, okay? So we've already opened the door for some by letting them know that we are doing clinical trials. And sometimes people will come in and ask, are you doing amazing? They will ask, are you doing anything? Do I qualify for anything? So I think just letting people know that you are doing clinical trials for a private, practice does help open the door to let people know that you are there. to do that. So that's one of the ways that we, get people in by doing that. And also, I think that the experience that they have is your best calling card. Others will say that. And like I say, believe it or not, just giving somebody a donut or giving them something that has no real monetary value is important, because it shows that you are caring, or it's just a little trinket, something, a glass or something that has your name on it that they can just take out when they've had a glass to drink. It gets it out, and they know what's going on in your office, and that can. I found that also brings people in, to be perfectly honest.
Absolutely, great points. And we've seen that here at Stanford with the Google baseline projects. Everyone's like, "Where's the free T-shirt?" Again, it's small things, but I think it really makes people want to come in and participate. So good to have gear. Dr. Velarde, any thoughts?
No, I think those symbols, I would agree with those symbols, are whether it is a little heart or anything that they ask you for those things, they're more eager to participate. Obviously, having some not financial reward, but paying them for having bus tickets to ride the bus and making that part of your budget. Obviously, that's something that you will need. To recruit patients that are not necessarily in your catchment area, that may be somewhere away from your zip code. So distributing and thinking ahead on those things, language, having recruiters that speak the language of the community that you're serving. So those are things that I find important.
Excellent points. And I think this was also brought up in a prior conversation, but just also making people come in less, right? So making them, if you can do things remotely, use digital health, use phone calls, meet people where they are, because having them come in for study visits is really cumbersome for some of our patients. Sorry. Please, Dr. Palaniappan.
I was just reviewing the SGLT2 and GLP-1 clinical trials, and 80% of the participants in those 10,000 participant in total clinical trials were white men. And I think lowering barriers to participation is going to be very important, so that we actually have people that we treat in the clinical trials. And I think, Dr. Bland, the excellent points that you made, because we want people in your practice in the clinical trials so they can inform your practice. And, it's a virtuous cycle.
Absolutely. Excellent point. So do you guys think that we need to think about strategies in specific for, each race, ethnic group, or each certain population, age group, which obviously can get pretty granular as we try to create a very diverse study population? Or is there just a best practice that can be used for all groups? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is definitely evolving, and I'm lucky, as Dr. Rodriguez is, to be in Silicon Valley, where, some of these newer technologies are being tried out. And I'll give an example of the Apple Watches and being able to study arrhythmias in tens of thousands of people. I mean, that was inconceivable even 5 years ago. And, employing some of these new technologies so that we can get a larger number of participants with lower touch. And that does create noise, but you can offset that by having a larger sample size to really be able to find your signals. But this is all, something that we will have to navigate as we balance, as they did, for instance, with the Apple Heart Study, the liability issues, for instance, of having people's heart rhythms come in for tens of thousands of people, and the actionability of finding abnormal rhythms, and where does that responsibility and liability lie. So I think these will be important ethical, legal, and social implications going forward.
That also brings up a really good point of, where does research and clinical care, where does that line drawn? A lot of our study participants feel like they're getting an executive kind of evaluation, right? And there's an expectation that you return results, but of course that changes clinical care. So there's a lot to do now, especially with so much information that's available when we do all these studies, and how do we return them in a way that's both ethical, but also doesn't impede with the study design question, right? So a lot to do there. Dr. Velarde, Dr. Bland, any thoughts about it? Do we need to target interventions specifically for specific communities, or one size fits all? That's very comprehensive.
Well, when you say, how do you target groups? I don't know if you're talking about interventions or how you recruit men. Are we talking about recruitment?
So not the actual study.
Right. So for recruitment, I think that you have to look at the barriers of specific groups, right? For example, I mentioned the need to communicate in their language. So culturally, I think the approaches have to be language sensitive, culturally sensitive. Sometimes you tend to be more effective and perhaps more productive in recruitment when you model your specific tools to design more for that community, right? So, for example, I've had we have been doing this healthy living project in 3 different ethnic communities, and we approach them a little different. The Spanish community likes, music, food, and so you culturally kind of address those communities a little different. Interestingly, many of those communities have a lot of similarities, so you get to see what are the similarities. The African American community are, they like the group of women talking together and having raffles and understanding what moves their, what moves the community, and working with local leaders, I think, is the way to take the pulse of the community and what you're likely to be more effective. I would not approach a Hispanic Latino community without people that are bilingual. They have to speak the language. And so, and that sort of thing.
That's great points. Dr. Bland?
Well, one of the things that we found is sometimes partnering with the churches, partnering with other organizations, some of the social organizations, so that people, again, know that this is safe. These are institutions that are safe. Partnering with barbershops, partnering with beauty salons where people feel safe. I think those are some of the ways that, especially in the African American population, that are important. We need to feel safe. We need to know that no one is trying to take advantage of us. And again, because you're going to hear, okay, you're not just playing with us. You're not just trying to experiment on me. What about that Tuskegee thing? It comes up constantly.
Yeah. That's really a great suggestion. And that was actually my next question, which you've answered, is do you have examples of practices that have been successful in your clinical trials that you've led to recruit specific populations? Dr. Velarde talked about the healthy heart, having music and food and different interventions, and Dr. Bland partnering with community organizations such as churches. Dr. Palaniappan, anything from your end from the Asian community studies?
So I really liked what was brought up earlier today in the steering committee on radio shows. And it is so amazing with satellite radio. I mean, there's sort of a multitude of Asian languages because they make up 60% of the world. But you can target each one of these subgroups through satellite radio, and it's cost effective. And it was brought up in the steering committee meeting this morning that people still listen to radio. We think we're all on our phones all the time now, but people do listen to the radio, and it's a very good way to target Asian communities and in particular. And then there was also TV stations for specific Asian subgroups, and it's really, really amazing. I'm writing a grant now on diversity in the United States and how it improves all of our health because we're exposed to different foods and perhaps less smoking and more physical activity. And I really believe that the diversity in the United States makes our health better. And it's important to target these diverse groups to get them into research and meet them where they are, essentially.
That's wonderful. Really great advice. So we're really talking a lot about changes within the investigators and the structures for research in our different institutions. What do we think in terms of the bigger picture? Who's responsible for this? Should this be a mandate from the FDA, commitment from pharmaceutical companies that are generally sponsoring these trials? Do payers need to insist that diverse trials, so there's reimbursement for this? What do you guys think about the policy implications?
I'll start. Just as I said in sort of my second to last slide, is that this is responsibility of all of us, and it's a conversation. And I loved the slide that Dr. Coons showed earlier of the barber shops, the New England Journal of Medicine trial that showed an intervention in barbershops really improved blood pressure to a significant degree. And I'm wondering, because why don't I see that graph in where I get to the barbershop, right? So there should be a virtuous cycle of, we did this study in barbershops and now we're showing what the results are, similar to now how we have, wear a mask and the COVID side, the public health departments should put these out. And then that hopefully will help us recruit more participants for clinical trials from barbershops or temples or churches, because we're feeding that back, the research back to them. And so we all members of this cycle need to be virtuous in this messaging, I guess. So
that's a great point. And that also came up in this steering committee, right? That we generate in science great research like the barbershop trial that's published in our highest academic journal. But how do we actually translate that information into language that our participants, that our communities understand and care about? And we certainly need to do a better job at that. I completely agree. Dr. Velarde, Dr. Bland, any thoughts on that? Who else? What are the other key players and what are their responsibilities beyond the research institutions and investigators?
Well, since the Institute of Medicine, and I'm trying to remember the date, was it 2003, said that there are, disparities of healthcare, there's a mandate to incorporate, quote unquote, to incorporate diverse groups into any research. Things haven't really translated into, we still have these big studies that, as Dr. Palaniappan mentioned, for example, is all Caucasian cohorts. You have all these great cardiac studies coming and just presented in the European Society of Cardiology, for example, that is still carry 80% Caucasian population, obviously more reflective of Europe. But so you still get a sense that things are not translating to research. So who should guide this? Should it be a mandate? Should it be, the NIH, I think, has a call for this. Diversity, gender in academia is coming from the American Heart Association with Dr. Robin Carrington really leading the way in stuff like this, just in academia, but also in research. So we need those big voices to come out and say, this is what we need. And but how it percolates, how we, assimilate it in all other research venues, it's really up to the younger generation, the physicians that are on the making, and say we cannot tolerate this and this has to change. But it has to be mandated from the institutions that govern all of the research that we do. And pharma has a responsibility on this. How this gets done is difficult. We have these positions, but how does it get translated? And I know the NIH is taking some lead in this, but I'd be happy to hear other people's thoughts about this.
And absolutely, there's certainly requirements, right? So for reporting and mandating, but how strictly are they enforced? I don't really know the answer to that, and obviously we still have ways to go with that. Dr. Bland?
Yes, I really think that it has to be from above. I think the FDA has to start mandating that. We need to see diverse people in these. And as you said, a lot of these studies, and a lot of times I'll ask people, who was in this study? And there's in this 1%, 2%, 4% of people who look like me. It's important. This drug is supposed to be used in everyone, and we need everyone represented in order to tell what really is going on with it. There are differences in us, and it needs to come from above. Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more. And I'll just ask one more question to the panelists and then open it up to the Q&A because of the times that we're in. So I think one of the topics that's in all of our mind is COVID-19 and vaccine trials. Do you feel that at this point, in this inflection point, the importance of recognizing and recruiting diverse populations, do you think that that is a priority and will be a priority in these vaccine trials?
It should be a priority, and I hope that it is being a priority. I recently wrote an article talking about that we as African Americans need to have a seat at that table. So it is a priority, and I think it should be. I'm very happy to see, I've seen patients in my practice even today who are in a vaccine trial that's being done at our local hospital here. And I was very pleased to see that are African Americans. So I think it's very important that we all are in this trial.
That's wonderful to hear. Dr. Palaniappan?
I am aware that there are talks at the FDA and CDC, as well as NIH, to really consider the ethical considerations, and it has been proposed to use measures like area deprivation index, for instance, to make sure that we get to equity versus equality in vaccine distribution. But of course, I want to acknowledge, Dr. Bland has brought up the Tuskegee experiment, and Carmen also brought up American Indians and their reluctance to participate in research given problems with informed consent, frankly, previously, where researchers said they would study, one disease, diabetes, and then studied, schizophrenia and other diseases. And I might hand it over to Dr. Vora to talk a little bit about the American Indian issue, because he is the expert. You'll be hearing a little bit more from him lately, but if you don't mind commenting, Dr. Vora.
Sure. Good afternoon. Great question, and that's true for native communities, where, as you recall, essentially the challenge for the native population is to be counted and to be visible. And one of the trending hashtag in native population is "I'm still here," and the prevailing idea around what a native person should look like. And so it's such a fundamental issue around identity that they have to contend with. And then when it comes to genetics, we have to realize that the US government back in the days instituted the so-called blood quantum rule around fraction of ancestry of native heritage to be counted towards being a tribal member. Many tribes do not agree to that as well. It's more of a self-identity. But when it's linked to your ancestry, the issues around DNA testing and how that may really change self-perception around who we are as individuals or as a community. Besides, of course, the many examples of really egregious use of genetic data beyond the scope of the initial research. The Havasupai case, a classic case that most people know about as well in Arizona. So does the Native Hawaiian population. They've had some issues around genetic research not being a truly participatory research. So yes, we do have to recognize that that this is an issue, and acknowledge it and include Native leaders in the design process from the beginning.
Thank you. Back to you, Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Vora. Dr. Velarde, any thoughts about this on the COVID-19 vaccine trials that are obviously on their way and more to come?
I want to concur with what Dr. Bland mentioned. I think that it is critical that minority groups that represent a large number of frontline workers that are exposed significantly, they overrepresent. When you're part of the population at the 15-20% and you represent 40% of the COVID affected patients, if you don't have a seat at the table, it's criminal. So you have to be at the table. On a positive side, there are vaccine trials that are going on in Latin America, in other countries. And I think that the discourse of the United States should be, the scientific community should be opened up to see what is happening in Latin America. You know, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, especially Brazil and Peru are being hit significantly. And these trials are going on, and we can learn a lot from that experience when it comes to Latin America, similarly with other regions and other Asian countries. So we should not be isolated. You know, the United States, especially with COVID, because that will really help us in how we address and who we target.
Excellent points. And I think clearly having a global disease makes international recruitment, and that's already happening much quicker and more realistic. However, I think as Dr. Palaniappan mentioned, when you have a disproportionate burden, this is issue of equity, right? That you have more representation. So extra efforts need to be taken to make sure that these trials are happening in these communities and that these communities reap the benefits of the research sooner, or at least at the same time. So thank you for all those excellent comments. That's all the questions I have prepared. And I think we have one question so far popped up in the Q&A, and I'll read out loud to the participants and then we can try to answer it.
Yep, and really quickly, Dr. Rodriguez, there's one question that's in the Q&A, but then there I also see there's another question in the chat. So you have two questions so far. Yep.
So it's from an anonymous attendee, and the question is: NIH trials like All Hats, Sprint, Accord, et cetera, successfully enroll large numbers of Black patients, yet recent industry-sponsored outcomes in heart failure, lipids, CKD, and diabetes all lack diversity. Are there best practices for the NIH trials which can be applied to industry trials? And certainly, I'll just start by saying it depends on the subject area, but in general, we have not found that the sponsor of the trial necessarily affects the diversity of the trial. So we've looked at this across a bunch of disease states, and in general, for most diseases, it looks like they're both equally bad at recruiting diverse patients, unless the trial is specifically targeted for those patients. So I'll let Dr. Palaniappan, I think she wants to comment.
So that's a great question, and I'm in the business of running and applying for NIH grants. And to answer your question about whether there are some NIH best practices that we can apply to industry, the answer is yes. There's something called a targeted planned enrollment table, and NIH forces you to put a distribution in all of the race, ethnic groups, and gender groups before you even plan your trial. And if you don't have adequate representation, the reviewers will ask you why you don't have adequate representation, and NIH tracks it now. So I had two diabetes clinical trials where I recruited 700 patients, and they were meant to represent the demographics of the Bay Area. And by the demographics of the Bay Area, I had one American Indian male that I expected to recruit, and 3 years into the 5-year study, I hadn't recruited one American Indian male. So when I submitted that progress report, NIH asked me, why don't you have that American Indian male? And then we were prompted to, and I should have done this before, and mea culpa, but we then worked with the Office of Community Engagement, which has great relationships with American Indian tribes in the Bay Area, and we were able to recruit that one American Indian male. But it is about metrics. It's about measuring what matters and then changing behavior.
Great points. Dr. Velarde or Dr. Bland, any comments on that?
I was in the all-head trial, and I think that in that particular trial that they did look at small offices like mine, and they did use us. But I think in some of the heart failure trials and things of that nature, you may not be looking in that population, of smaller offices. You're looking in cardiology offices that may not have, a different population. And you may not be able to get them. And also, I'm looking at who is taking care of the patients. Again, if there are people who look like you who are there, you feel a little bit more comfortable with that. And I think when you don't have people who are in the cardiology realms who look like you may not get those patients to join.
Great points.
Yeah, I want to just add to what Latha said and to what Dr. Bland mentioned is, it is very hard. They ask you for these metrics that you have to fulfill this for NIH. I haven't applied for an NIH grant, but I know that they ask you, to check these boxes. But then you ask what happens later, right? When they reviewed it and they approve it, there's some lost connection there that we don't see that translated into some of the studies that we see. And I don't know what that is. Maybe it has to do that there's not enough people that represent and look like them leading these trials and pushing these trials. And that's where I make the connection between what Latha said and what Veita or Dr. Bland said is like, you're not pushing for that because you don't look like them and they don't look like you. So it's something that comes to mind often, and that's why we need more diversity in up on the top to write these things through and to see them come a reality.
Absolutely. So I think what everybody's saying, you have to be purposeful about this. And you have to make it required, right? So I think when a funding body say, you basically have to recruit this in these amount of patients because you said they're going to, and if not, if you tried and you can't, which I think happens a lot in clinical trials, that you start with very good intentions, but then it's really difficult to recruit because of your catchment area or the issues with distrust that we've talked about, then we really need to do better. And I do believe our industry partners are working hard to do the same. And again, the metric, this is something that's always changing, the metrics for how we're measuring success here. Nimako, you mentioned there was another question. I'm not seeing it on the.
Yes, it's in the chat box and I can read it if you like.
Sure.
When thinking about the broader context of how population health can be visible, there should be a much larger role for those that lead to public health. The CDC as a federal entity, nonprofits like Trust for American Health, Gates Foundation, de Beaumont Foundation, among others, to support research participants as well as next generation of researchers. But it looks like the rest of it may have gotten cut off. Apologies. I'm not sure what happened to the end part of their question, but that was a comment that was put out there.
Great comment. I'm not sure so much of a question, but any thoughts on that?
Agree.
Yeah, great comment. We agree.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I don't see any other questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, and just want to let folks know there's a last call if there are any questions for Drs. Rodriguez, Palaniappan, Velarde, or Bland.
Fatima, it's David Kuntz. May I ask a question?
Of course.
First of all, terrific panel. Thank you all for your thoughts. This is a question for Dr. Bland, and it's good to connect with you from many years ago. I think what you're doing in a private practice setting is truly unique. And I have more of an operational question. It's difficult for many practices in my experience to incorporate research into a private practice environment, to learn protocols, to follow safe research practices, to figure out how to, from a business standpoint, conduct effective research side by side with patient care. So I'm just wondering a few pointers for those of us who might want to take back to our organizations, engaging private practitioners into clinical research?
It's not always easy, I would say that, to do it. It's something, you know, we've known each other for a long time, and it's something that I really have a passion about, and something that I hope keeps me on the quote unquote cutting edge. So I feel like I stay in abreast of everything that's going on so I can give my patients the best care in the long run. But the deal is this: I need sponsors who understand that it may take us a little bit longer to get these people in. And also, I need to have a little bit more financial support in doing it, because I may not get 700 people. I know I won't get 700 people. I may only get 20 people in a study. But I have to make the numbers work for, for everything. So it's not always easy. And we have, in this city, we have a lot of people who are doing research also. So that definitely makes it a little bit more difficult to get these. But I think you need to have someone who understands the importance of it, make sure that it's something that is important to the physicians that are the primary PIs that are in it. And my staff, I think the doctors that I work with feel that it is important. And then two, you know, your staff has to be well trained. I was lucky enough that my staff, one of my primary people is someone who came from another country who had an MD. She was fabulous. She's fabulous. You know, she knows a lot already. So I have a good staff, and that's really most important, having that staff. But the finances have to work. You know, we're constantly trying to find studies, and right now it's kind of lean finding studies, to be perfectly honest, that are appropriate for us. So hopefully sponsors will understand that we have a lot to give, and they will hopefully look for people that are like us.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. That's really excellent. And I mean, even making it financially viable at places even where Dr. Palaniappan and I practice, where everything's just more expensive. You know, it's especially for NIH studies. And I'll tell you, as a junior investigator, sometimes you're in the red for agreeing to participate in these studies. So you really want to make it feasible for individuals to do that as part of their job and to have their time covered.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. I think that's all we have for questions, unless there's anything else. But this has been a really inspirational panel by three amazing women, so leaders in the field. And we thank Dr. Palaniappan, Dr. Velarde, Dr. Bland for their contributions and expertise